Welcome everybody to our special session, the Open Metaverse, a worthy goal or a pipe dream. We have an illustrious panel here with us with some of the best experts and analysts about the metaverse. So let's hear first a quick introduction to each one of you, what you do and how does it relate to the metaverse. Let's start with Charlie. Take it away.
Thanks for the introduction, Ori. As many of you know, I'm the author of 3 books, starting with Metaverse, which was released in 2018, so it was written in 2017. I'm an adjunct faculty member at Chapman University, where I teach 2 classes about XR.
Thank you, Charlie. Miriam?
Yes, hi, my name is Miriam Jouar. I'm a technology journalist and podcaster and entrepreneur and former developer in the video game field. So I deal with the metaverse, or, you know, all the R's, XR, VR, AR in my work pretty regularly, and I have in the past.
Thank you, Miriam. Great to have you. Anshel.
I'm Anshel Sog. I am an analyst covering the XR space. I've been covering XR as an analyst since I joined the company about 7 years ago, worked for Moor Insights and Strategy. And before that, I was a journalist and had my own publication and started covering VR, AR, and other Rs within the metaverse prior to that. And I'm very on the hardware heavy side, so I try to get my head in as many headsets as I can and understand the limitations of silicon and optics.
Fantastic. Thank you. Tim, tell us about yourself.
Hi, I'm Tim Bajarin. I'm chairman of Creative Strategies, one of the oldest high-tech firms in Silicon Valley. I've had the privilege of covering a lot of technology for over 40 years, but I started looking at VR specifically around 92, 93 when Jared Lanier began writing about it and talking about it. And since then, I've been looking a lot about the whole concept of not only VR, XR, and AR, but most recently, of course, virtual worlds in the metaverse.
Thank you all for joining us. Let's get right into it. As you know, the metaverse is still a term that is being defined. We're still trying all to figure out exactly what it is. And when it comes to an open metaverse, the same thing applies. There's a lot of opinions. It means different things to different people. For some people, the open metaverse means open source. For others, the open metaverse is basically a Web3 or a way to fight big tech. For others, it's about interoperability and standards that allows all these different virtual worlds to be connected. For some, it's even an open economy, like a DeFi. And for some, it's just, a place where everyone can join. So it's really open to everyone. So let's do kind of a quick roundtable here to get your opinion on what it means an open metaverse for you. Charlie, why don't you kick it off?
Sure. Well, let's start with a definition we could agree on the metaverse. It's obviously a phrase that's new to most people, but we've been talking about it for 25 years. And the definitive statement on the metaverse, I think, was written by Matthew Ball. He's a former Amazon strategy executive and now the head of a company called Epilion, which runs an electronic traded fund on the New York Stock Exchange, which is a bucket of metaverse stocks. And all the usual suspects are in there: Facebook, Qualcomm, Microsoft, blah, 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 ad infinitum. But it is a brilliant document, which I think lays out a lot of the fundamental ideas. It drills down on some things, it skimps on others. It assumes there'll be an open metaverse. Meta itself has said that they want to have an open metaverse, and we'll have to see how that unfolds. There is a technology layer, the equivalent of what HTTP and web addresses is, that allows us to navigate the internet as we know it today. And obviously we'll need an equivalent technology which will help us navigate the digital twin of the real world, as well as this fictional made up virtual reality world, which will be, as Mark Zuckerberg said, an internet that you're looking out on instead of in on.
Thank you, Charlie. So your open metaverse means that you can navigate between different places, different virtual
Well,
world.
this meta layer is going to allow you to bring probably your most important assets with you from place to place. So it's your avatar or your let's call it your identity, because your identity will include lots of costumes that you might own and digital currency and probably most of the apps that are on your smartphone. Right, you'll bring your smartphone with you as you move around, and so to the extent that things are going to be connected, you want to have access to those assets in every environment that you go into. That said, when you go into the world of Warcraft, whether you call it planet, server, whatever, you'll have to follow those rules, because really we're not talking about a metaverse, but rather lots of metaverses that may or may not be connected to the larger thing, depending on who owns them and what they use them for.
Okay. So Miriam, moving on to you, what does an open metaverse means to you?
Well, I mean, ideally for me, it would be something that's like what the web became, although that's a double-edged sword, because as we know today, the web is highly concentrated around corporate interest and has been in kind of some ways corrupt by that. A lot of people living in walled gardens, as it were. But looking at the positive, Firefox still exists, surprisingly. I kind of would like to see it go in that direction. I would love to see standards created that all can subscribe to, that create standardized hardware and standardized software stack, standardized networking stack, something that builds upon the web to kind of launch pad into the metaverse, because I think the web can evolve into this. I don't think it has to be a separate thing. To me, as soon as you think of it as a separate thing, it means walled garden. Immediately, you're just kind of creating that space, that distinction. So that's kind of what I like to see. But, I've been around the block a few times, so look at the state of the web today, and it's a bit of a mess, but it always was. It's just a bit of more of a corporate mess now, which is I'm not necessarily quite on board. Now, I'm not a huge open source advocate myself, but I do feel that having some openness, especially in standards and protocols, and as I said, Firefox is a good example of something that has managed to survive and is still open and still tries to stick to standards and doesn't have quite as much of an agenda as some corporate interest. So there we go.
All right, interoperability and open standards will make the metaverse open. Anshel, moving on to you, which camp are you on?
I'm definitely in the camp of an open metaverse. I kind of mirror Miriam's comments in that ideally it should be an open metaverse, but realistically we've kind of moved into this corporate walled garden system where, Charlie was talking about being able to take your things across metaverses, but today you can't take your music across ecosystems or your movies across ecosystems. So, what are the chances you'll be able to take your 3D clothes or your new hat that you bought? So I think that the real problem is that a lot of the corporate interests that exist today, it's not really in their best interest to allow portability. So I think something where we incentivize portability and make it something where you have these standards that allow for the movement of assets across platforms and creating potentially these, ideas where we all agree as an industry to potentially allow for the movement of content across platforms and give people more ownership of their content. Because today, a lot of the content people have is just kind of leased on property, and once you leave that property, it's no really longer yours. So I think that's something to consider when we talk about the metaverse, is giving people more freedom with the things that they own.
Okay, fantastic. And Tim, let's wrap up this question with you. When you see a metaverse, what would make you say it's open? Oh, sorry, you're still on mute.
Right. Hopefully, when I look at the metaverse, I think of it more of a big virtual world. And Charlie kind of mentioned it in the right context of it, the digital twin in the metaverse. And it really should be open in the same way that the internet itself had protocols and HTTP and others of the standards that made it open. But I agree with Miriam and Anshel in the sense that it's going to be hijacked, I think, that the corporate interests, especially now that they've learned how to use subscription models to keep you within their little worlds, I think that they're going to make it more difficult for us to have what I would call a truly open internet. The standard committees that are working on this, I think, are going to play a big role, but I have great concerns about how a Netflix or a HBO or whoever is going to approach their version of it to want to keep you within their virtual metaverse.
Cool. So quick question for everybody. Is Web3 a requirement for an open metaverse? Let's show by a thumbs up or down. We have one thumb up. All right. That's not bad. All right. Moving on to the next question. Let's dig into some of the standards that you all mentioned. So when you look at the tech stack, where would we need to have those standards? What would they enable us to do in the open metaverse? Anshel, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, so I think one of the big standards that we've seen pick up a lot of steam is OpenXR. I think the Kronos Group has done a very good job there. And I'll be honest with you, I was very surprised to see how quickly both Microsoft and Facebook have adopted it, Meta now. But I think that we need to have more open standards around interactions, eye tracking, all the different components of what's needed in a tech stack to be standardized, agreed upon, and also, making sure that privacy is a big component of what is built into the standard. And I think OpenXR has done a very good job of that so far.
And in that context, I would add gestures, how you do gestures, and then specifically in the context of manipulating pixels, how do we address 3D in standards?
So when people say, I want to be able to freely move between the different places or worlds in the metaverse, what would it mean from a user experience perspective? Some people said you want to have a portal where you can just walk through it to the next world, or is it going to be a click? What's your take on that?
Well, I'm not sure how easy that will be given the way it's approached right now, but that's the way it should be. I should be able to enter the metaverse or whatever the big picture is and navigate freely to whatever place I want to go to or whatever thing I want to see. But I'm not sure if the standards and things are even in place to make that happen.
Miriam, what are some of the standards we need to enable an open metaverse?
I mean, I think OpenXR is a good answer. I agree with Anshel on that. I think for me, the reason I did thumbs up on Web3, I'm not a huge Web3 fan, but I feel like we should co-develop those concepts. I'm not actually gung-ho on Web3 the way a lot of people want to see it, but I think there are some things in there that we need to add to the Web 2, and that could kind of be a jumping point or a springboard for the metaverse. I'm also more of an AR believer than a VR believer. And I might be wrong on that. I might be proven wrong for the first time in terms of the fact that I've never seen VR take off ever, because I feel like, sure, some people are going to want to immerse themselves completely, but that's just AR with shutters in front of the glasses, right? Like you're basically not rendering reality, right? And actually don't like the idea of rendering reality. I think that we should be able to see reality and superimpose, but that's my point of view. And I think if you see it that way, then it kind of makes sense that, and again, I hate the word metaverse. I actually think it's terrible. I'm really annoyed with the fact that we're all using that word right now. But I think that what I want to see evolve is a world where augmented reality becomes a thing in everything we do. And, beyond that, in a more immersive way, VR becomes a thing as a superset of AR that's purely for entertainment, basically. So that's kind of how I see it.
And some of the other organizations that are working to make the open metaverse, you mentioned the OpenXR, there's a Kronos Group, there's Oasis, and a few others. Which are some of the ones that you are kind of your go-to organizations that are working on making the open metaverse?
IEEE has multiple committees that are looking at various standards and open standards as well. And I just looked at some of the stuff that they published recently, and that would be worth checking out.
Okay, cool. All right, so let's move on to some of the contenders, those who are trying to take a lead position, and let's see, what their approach is currently towards an open or maybe a not so open metaverse. What's kind of your take on how Facebook or Meta is approaching the metaverse in terms of openness?
I think that I kind of mentioned earlier, I was a bit surprised that they, pushed OpenXR and that they were one of the first to adopt it. Not only that, but they are now making it like the standard for their APIs. So I think that they are clearly interested in the open metaverse to a certain degree. But I also think that they want to own a lot of the content that's on their piece of the metaverse, whether it's you call it their walled garden or you call it their marketplace, whatever they decide to call their place where they generate revenue. The reality is, I think they still want to keep people inside their ecosystem, purchasing things through them, making different types of transactions using their cryptocurrencies. And I think that they just want to have their piece of the metaverse, and they want that piece to be more open than I think a lot of people would have expected from Meta. But I think they're doing a much better job than I think a lot of other people would have expected in terms of openness. That said, there are still considerable amounts of concerns around privacy, which I think is going to be their biggest uphill battle.
All right, Charlie, what's your take on Meta's ability, willingness to make the metaverse open?
Well, at the moment, I think we have to take them at their word that they want to be a relatively benevolent force and put privacy first. They say it so many times, it's a little worrisome. But I do think that they want their message to be heard, that they're, coming in peace, and they're spending $10 billion a year to jumpstart an industry that wouldn't exist without them, in my opinion. So of course, I have mixed feelings about the company. I have mixed feelings about the power of one individual and some of the issues that have gone on with the social media sites that make me fear we're about to repeat every mistake we made building the web on the thing that comes after it, spatial computing, the metaverse, whatever we want to call it. And part of the reason is that no one is accountable. You have multiple identities, you control whomever you like, you can spread disinformation in whatever way you want. And of course, if we don't do that in the real world because we try and be socially responsible beings. But in the metaverse, you can be as destructive as you want and not be held accountable. So, I have advocated for an ICANN-like organization, which would be a not-for-profit that would manage things like identity. So I thought that Facebook had the right idea in trying to make everybody on Oculus have one identity. Of course, they were the wrong people to do it. And again, I'm not saying you can't wear a costume in the metaverse. Of course you can. You can be a horse, you could be a butterfly, anything you want to be, but you have to have one identity. So if as a horse you went and robbed a bank, it's not your alias. There is one identity. So, I doubt we're going to get there. I think it's more or less certain we're going to fall prey to bad actors, and we see what has happened on the internet, and it'll be 100 times worse. But one thing we always do is we hurdle ourselves toward disruption without ever really considering, 3 chess moves ahead. What does the destruction, for example, of the internet? We destroyed the gatekeepers. Well, what does that mean? It means that the truth can never be repressed, right? The George Floyd thing never could have happened without social media, but neither could the insurrection on the Capitol. So, I think we are constantly going to struggle, and it's not in a way it's because of technology, and people can't keep up, and governments can't keep up, and our social relationships can't keep up with how fast technology is changing the world. And humans are flawed, and that is our fundamental problem, and it follows us through to every technology we invent.
All right, so I guess Meta at least has good intentions to make the metaverse open. Let's pick on.
God, I hope so.
Let's pick on another contender. Let's talk about Apple. Apple actually said that they're kind of the anti-metaverse metaverse. But you know, they have a great track record in creating walled gardens with the excuse that it creates a better user experience, which actually is pretty true in many cases. So what's your take on how Apple will tackle the openness of the metaverse?
Well, I'll start. I've covered Apple for 40 years, and I have a fairly good sense of their thinking. And I agree that I don't see them getting out of a walled garden within their customers. You know, they're not going to open up what they have to an Android phone, let's say, if they're using the iPhone as the medium for delivering the first phase of this. Having said that, I do believe Cook and the folks over at Apple do realize that this is much bigger than the whole concept of just a walled garden. And I think that they're going to want to expand to some degree how they do this. But again, I have to believe it stays within their own operating system in order to deliver the user experience that they want or believe that they should be to deliver in this concept.
All right, thank you, Tim. Any other thoughts on Apple and the?
Yeah. So Apple, of course, is going to give us a great experience. They might give us some open source stuff that we might be able to use, like they did with some of the projects they've worked on. Mind you, Meta might do that as well. But I think, you know, it's just going to be very shiny, very polished, very privacy centric, and very much an ecosystem play. I don't think any of these companies right now, including Google, Amazon, whatever is involved, are going to change their way of doing things at all for this.
Yeah.
And I don't think they're going to be interested in collaborating with others on standards, at least as much as it was back in the day of the early web. Or like what we really need is somebody to come in from left field like Tesla did in the car business and just break everything and disrupt and create something new. I don't really, I mean, the existing players will give us some sort of metaverse, 100%. They have the technical know-how, the money, but I don't think it's what we want, what we will want.
Let's talk about some of the players that have probably some of the most advanced precursors to the metaverse, like Roblox and Epic Games with Fortnite. And, you know, I heard Tim Sweeney, CEO of Epic Games, say that, and I'm quoting, "I think the metaverse as an open platform could ultimately be an order of magnitude larger than any one company, including Epic." Sweeney says that he believes the metaverse must be open and built on Web3. What's your take on kind of the Roblox and Fortnites of the world? How can they become open and really kind of deliver on this promise?
You know, I actually had a conversation with Tim Sweeney about the metaverse 5-6 years ago now. And he's very consistent with the messaging, but I agree that when you think about the fact that we're looking at a virtual space and the ability to create essentially things out of thin air, and the cost is really just compute and power, there is a potential to create unlimited resources and unlimited products and unlimited things that people can purchase. That said, rarity is a big thing in crypto. And I just think that when you look at the potential opportunity, game engines have been a big driver of that, and enabling people to build on the experience and skills that they have in building games and 3D assets for games and pulling that into virtual worlds like Roblox, like Minecraft, like Fortnite. You know, I've gone in and tried to experience some of these metaverse-like events where, you know, there's a concert in Fortnite, right? I wanted to see what it was like. And honestly, it is a different experience. And it's interesting because you can go around and bungee jump between, platforms while you're watching a 60-foot character of an artist playing live, or even pre-recorded for that fact. But I think that it's a very different type of experience. And I think one thing that's really missed by a lot of these virtual concerts and other events is you have the ability to reach so many more people than you otherwise would have been in person. And being able to give people potentially a different experience that's more engaging in some ways, and less engaging in others, that also gives way more people access, maybe even at a lower cost, I think it creates a much bigger potential opportunity than, say, having a limited one-time event in person. And I think when you create these virtual spaces and have stuff like Roblox, I think these are glimpses into what's potentially possible in the future. And that's why I think, when these started happening, lots of people started using the metaverse word before Meta became it, or Meta made it as popular as it is today.
All right, thank you, Anshel. Any other thoughts on Roblox and Epic Games and how they could make the metaverse open?
I think game engines clearly can play a big role here. You could turn the meta layer into a plugin, and anything that's made in Unity or Unreal Engine could, essentially include it as an underlying architecture in the tech stack, which I know we were talking about for a second when I had to walk away. So, the game engines have a big role, and I think they will have a big role in it. For example, there could be a avatar standardization, and that you might run that through a game engine.
So, I mean, if all the metaverses, to your point, run on the same game engine, that makes it easy to make it interoperable.
Yes, sir.
But is that sustainable? I mean, what about metaverse that would be built on other game engines like Unity or others?
I mean, again, I'm assuming that there's this meta layer that everybody wants to plug into, and they just make it easy and apply a standard. But we'll see. Again, I think there's not going to be one standard. I think it's an Android versus iOS situation where probably the game engine's going to give you options, just like it does today.
All right, so let's talk about some of the other contenders on a more kind of foundational level for the metaverse. There's Qualcomm, which makes hardware for the metaverse, chips for the metaverse. There's NVIDIA that is working on making streaming for the metaverse better and more scalable. What are your take on these players and how they can make it open?
I'll chime in, I guess. I think Qualcomm is an interesting one because they very clearly started with intentions of being a hardware-only play in the metaverse. They're the primary supplier of the majority of headsets today. And I think that they've realized that software is becoming an increasingly important part of that. And they've expanded their software ecosystem and created things like Snapdragon Spaces through acquisitions like Wikitude and Clay Air. And now they're talking about, having standardization around gestures and having standardization around, SLAM and other things. So I think they are an interesting player because they're helping to standardize certain features simply by building them into the hardware and offering software pointers in their APIs to make sure that all developers that are building these XR experiences today are building them with a certain level of base minimum capabilities, whether they're interactions or being able to recognize objects in the environment.
I also think that because Qualcomm's chips are going to be in the majority of the types of devices that could view metaverse content, will play a key role in helping if they are using Qualcomm products to drive some standards. We've spent a lot of time, and Anshel and I and others who spent a lot of time with Qualcomm, they've been very, very proactive on their role of trying to drive an open environment. And so we need to watch them, probably the closest of the semiconductor companies, because they will probably have the most influence on it.
Yeah, I think I agree with you both here. I think that Qualcomm has a big role to play, but I think we also should be looking at what NVIDIA is bringing to the table. I think the chip makers are probably right now the most open in terms of like this, wanting their hardware to work on whatever software is out there and may or may not become the standard. And in some cases, even pushing their own kind of idea of what it should look like to optimize with their hardware, which makes perfect sense. I mean, if you look back in the video games days, right? I was making video games in the late 90s on PCs, and graphics accelerators and audio accelerators weren't standardized then. I mean, in the sense that we didn't have even APIs.
Right.
I wrote code before DirectX and before, the NVIDIA stack, and in GL was pretty much the only thing we did then. And I mean, eventually, it kind of is stratified. And I think having that hardware constantly evolve is going to certainly give us a direction as to what we can and should be doing with the metaverse. And that's why I think we really should keep a close eye on what the hardware companies are doing. And I feel right now, the least antagonistic towards them than I feel versus the the big corporate silo ecosystem walled gardens that we have out there. But at the same time, I think that if you look at what we have, a lot of things on our phones today that are not gaming, that are the result of gaming. Even rendering the UI is now a result of gaming technology, and animojis again. And I think a lot of the metaverse is going to come from gaming, from game engines, from game titles, from themselves silos, unfortunately. But things like Minecraft are ripe for metaverse, right? Second Life has been around forever and it's an entire little ecosystem and universe going on in there.
Yeah, they have an
Anshel,
economy. They're actually a bank.
exactly. As Anshel was saying, there's also a bunch of others out there that are, having concerts in there. And I think that to me is more exciting because yes, it is a walled garden. But it's inside a game. You make the conscious choice to go in there. You're not kind of drag kicking and screaming into it like what Facebook's trying to do with Meta, I think. And so I think that I'm much more excited to see this social network kind of interactions come from within the games and grow to the public than us trying to drag the public in. And that's why I don't really trust the big, software players in this right
now. But
in
this case, though, I think it illustrates how smart Microsoft was to snap up Blizzard.
Oh, yeah.
Activision.
Yeah.
Not just because they want those titles for Xbox. I think they obviously want to also be on the Sony platform because they're making a ton of money. And I don't think they're going to stop that. But I think, as Miriam was saying, it sets them up in the future. If the metaverse is really us bopping around among metaverses, many of those metaverses will be game franchises. And you can bet World of Warcraft and Call of Duty and Overwatch are going to be some of those franchises.
The most successful one we've had.
Good job with these acquisitions, by and large.
The most successful one we've had so far has been Pokemon Go.
Yeah.
The most democratic, the most easily accessible, the most platform independent. And we need more of that.
Yeah.
And I think that's why Niantic is building Lightship off of what they did with Pokemon Go and other things they've built. And it makes total sense to have something that a developer can leverage now and create something that's more open. And I think that's really why they had their whole message when they launched Lightship, that they are the anti-metaverse company, right? Because they kind of want to be, they want you to get out there and experience AR, but in reality, there's still going to be a component of the metaverse, and there will still be, lots of virtual experiences. And what's funny is I mentioned my conversation I had with Tim Sweeney about the metaverse 5-6 years ago. Guess what? His idea was they're going to be social interactions that start in games. And I 100% agree that that's going to be how it happens. And I mean, if you look at what's going on with Discord and how everyone's using that as a social medium to go cross games, I think we're going to have something similar that will allow you to communicate with your friends across different platforms in the metaverse. It might not be audio only, it might expand into spatial mediums.
All right, folks, we're getting close to the end of our session. And I think we have established that the open metaverse is definitely a worthy goal. But the question is it a pipe dream? Or in other words, what are the odds that one day we will wake up and we'll see that the metaverse is indeed open?
Zero, because we didn't wake up and one day see the open web. It took years to get there. And then in hindsight, we were like, wait, we're here. It happened. We have Amazon building a book selling platform on this thing. It's happening. It's real. I think that's what we're going to do here. But it's going to be a lot of trial and error, a lot of broken legs, and a lot of stepping on toes. And I think that's just the way it is. I don't think there's any magic bullet. I'm actually more concerned that we're in a less good place now with the history of the web so far than to create something like that's open and exciting to the majority of people out there than we were back in before the web, because we didn't know what we were heading into. I think we kind of have an idea what we're heading into here, because I don't think it's a new thing. I think it's an evolution. We've been talking VR, AR since the 80s. Okay. When I was a teenager in high school, I was reading Popular Mechanics and they were talking about VR headsets. Remember?
Well, the internet doesn't disappear because we're talking
No,
about
of course
Right.
not.
next iteration. We're going to take the internet with us into whatever spatial environment we enter, right? You need, I mean, the internet is the gateway to the world's knowledge. And that is not going to change whether we are spatially present or present in the physical world.
Yeah. In the same way as we're still using laptops, despite all the people who said we wouldn't be anymore by now.
Yep.
So,
I think
but Miriam, but what I didn't understand is, are you saying that it's not going to happen overnight, but it will happen, or it has a chance to happen at some point in the future?
I think it's inevitable it'll happen, but I don't think it's going to happen in the structured way we think of it, or in the very quick way that we think of it. I don't even think it's going to happen in the corporate silo dark way that I'm thinking of it. I think, again, a disruptor might come and change everything. We don't have that yet.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say to change everything, it's still a very evolutionary, because as Charlie said, I don't think this is more than an extension to what we have already as the world encyclopedia that is the web. Thank you, Charlie, for those words. They're fantastic.
The other thing I would say is that corporate interests are going to slow this down.
Mm-hmm.
I agree that ultimately we're going to get to it at some point, but it's not going to happen soon.
When do you think it might happen?
Well, I always look 10 years out on things like this. I studied the adoption cycles a lot in our work. And basically anything that's really new, getting to the mass market, fundamentally takes about a 10-year cycle. There's only a few things that have broke through before that. But again, as Miriam said, she's right, that the whole thing is going to be an evolutionary process, but it's the corporate interests are going to absolutely slow it down.
I was just going to add that I think one of the things that a lot of people are forgetting is that everyone who's playing in the space today has lots of money, and the capital requirements to make this happen are ultimately the barrier to allowing it be as open as we would want it to be, allowing enough potential competitors to play in the space. And right now it's like, if you don't have a few $1 billion to spend, you probably aren't going to be very competitive today. And as a result of that, you have to look at how are people going to get their return on investment. And that is really why I think it's going to be a slow move. It's going to be something that happens gradually over time, as everybody else has said. And I think there will be players that will be introduced along the way once those really big barriers to entry are broken down or potentially no longer matter. That's when I think we'll see more competitors come to market and create new and interesting experiences that break outside of what we understand today to be the metaverse.
Charlie, any thoughts on
Well, here's one parting thought, and I heard it for the first time in 2016 at AWE, and it hit me like a ton of bricks in its simplicity and its truth. We overestimate the short term, and we underestimate the long term. You know, we said in the 90s when I was working at AOL, well, all advertising is going to be on the web. Well, that was correct, but it took 20 years. Right. So I think these things happen. The timing is hard to define. The inevitability is not. Will it be 5 years? Probably not. 10 years, things will be very different.
So, I mean, one of the thoughts that I heard quite often is that the main reason to make the metaverse open is that if we all work together, if the industry works together, we have a better chance to make it even bigger than it could be if just, single companies build it, right? So is there a chance that these companies will actually collaborate to make it bigger, to create a bigger pie that we all can benefit from?
Only if it means that it's bigger for them individually.
Agreed. I think ultimately the only way it makes sense for them to collaborate is if it overcomes a certain hurdle that otherwise would prevent it from being possible.
Yeah, I think we're probably going to see some kind of globbing of some corporate interests together, like maybe Qualcomm and some other company and some other company are going to get together and kind of create an open standard that's like maybe even open sourced because they need to solve a problem. As we know, a lot of the technology we have today comes from these kind of open source projects and from academia that contributes to the open source project, and that unfortunately corporate interests are constantly taking that away and modifying it without necessarily having the rights to on times, and it's a challenge. I just think that we're going to see that kind of cooperation for sure, because ultimately it's the technical limitations that are going to force people to collaborate, not so much the the corporate interests, I think.
So do we believe that the human nature will put us on a trajectory to make this open at some point in the future? Any thumbs up? Yes.
I'm an optimist.
Yeah, I'm
mostly optimists on this panel. All right, folks.
I'm an optimist. I think again, it's going to follow the development pattern on the web, so that you'll have internet and intranet. So a lot of the companies that we're talking about, it'll be closed or segmented among their clients, and they don't want people going back and forth. Security is the rule of the day. So I think we're going to see a lot of varied applications, but open basically and searchable. Yes, it has to be machine readable. It has to be searchable. That's how we're going to find ourselves in space, in the physical world.
So that's a great way to wrap up our panel discussion here. Thank you all for joining us for the Open Metaverse discussion. Thank you, Charlie, Miriam, Anshel, and Tim. You've been awesome. Let's continue this conversation and see when we can actually make the metaverse open. Thanks, everybody.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to see everyone.
Awesome.